Good morning. Barry Bryson joining you again for another 5 good minutes with the Word, and today we're introducing 1 Peter. 1st and 2nd Peter are letters that the Apostle Peter wrote, both of them towards the end of his life, probably both of them from Rome. He clearly writes from Rome at the end of 1 Peter. He tells us that, and then at the beginning of 2nd Peter, which we'll talk about tomorrow, he tells us that he knows his death is imminent. 1 Peter and 2nd Peter both address the coming challenges the church will face. 1 Peter addresses persecution, and 2nd Peter addresses false teaching, false doctrine, especially those who would warp what has already been taught by the apostles themselves. And he mentions the teachings of Paul specifically in 2nd Peter. It's a scary time when 1 Peter is written. Peter says in 1 Peter chapter 4, verse 12, that they should not be afraid of the fiery ordeal they are undergoing. And that's not a metaphor. Some of them were being burnt alive for their faith. It was a time following the burning of Rome when the Roman Empire had declared Christians, their mortal enemy. Christianity is no longer thought of as part of Judaism. It is not protected by law, and Christians are being persecuted throughout the empire for the first time by the empire. In the book of Acts, the empire and Roman officials almost always represent due process and come to the rescue of people who are being mistreated because of their Christianity. But no more. Rome recognizes that Christianity is not part of Judaism. 1 Peter is a whole lot like a letter from Paul in so many ways, especially the book of Ephesians. If, as you're studying this book, you look at your side references or your center column references, you see a lot of references to the book of Ephesians here. Chapter 1 really plows the same theological ground as Ephesians chapter 1. We are God's children, that we have been given the mysteries of God, the mysteries that the prophets talked about, that angels wanted to look into, and they didn't know the particulars, but we are the particulars, and we've been given to know those mysteries. And we have a parent-child relationship with God who has given us an inheritance that's imperishable. All those themes are in 1 Peter. They're also in Ephesians chapter 1. But Paul in Ephesians chapter 1 uses the metaphor of adoption as Paul does. But Peter, like John and like Jesus, uses the metaphor of birth. Since you have, in obedience to the truth, purified your souls for a sincere love of the brethren, fervently love one another from your hearts. For you have been born again, not of seed which is perishable, but imperishable, that is, through the living and abiding Word of God. Well, in chapter 2, he talks about the coming persecution. He sounds a lot like Paul when he uses the cornerstone imagery. Of course, he gets that himself from Jesus, Matthew chapter 21. And then in chapter 2, verse 11 through chapter 3, almost to the end of chapter 3, Paul is sounding a whole lot like Ephesians 5 and 6 and Colossians chapter 3, talking about our various relationships, our relationships in our communities, our relationships in our home, the Haustafel, the house rules that we have in Ephesians and Colossians, we also have in Peter. And they agree completely in their description of the behavior of Christians in our societies and our homes. The key word in all three books is the word to submit. We are submissive. We yield because we yield to God. And then in chapter 4, chapters 3 and 4, end of chapter 3, chapter 4, he talks specifically about persecution and how we handle persecution, that we shouldn't be surprised with persecution. When he says in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, that we need to be ready to give an answer, he's not talking about debate club. He's talking about being interrogated by the authorities. And he says we should always be able to give an answer and account for the hope that is in us, but with gentleness and reverence. We should always remember those two words when we talk about facing persecution, that we have a heart of gentleness and a heart of reverence when we are being mistreated. In chapter 5, he tells us that he's an elder. He's been an elder, and he gives advice to the elders. And here he's sounding like the pastoral epistles. He's sounding like 1 Timothy chapter 2. and the first chapter of Titus. At the end of chapter 5, he tells us that he's writing from Rome, Babylon. That's code for Rome. And he tells us that Silas and Mark are with him. So Paul's A-team, Paul's associates are there with Peter in Rome, which leads us to believe that Paul probably has already died and that Peter soon will die. But we'll talk more about that tomorrow. I hope that you'll read 1 Peter. It's an amazing book. It's a beautifully written book, vividly written book, and it's just the voice of the man we come to know in the Gospels. And he's just a wonderful person to always spend time with. And it trains us how to face hardship. Tomorrow, we'll talk about 2 Peter.